In this video, we're going to define what the ego is and how to let go of the ego using spirituality. The ego is concerned with the self. It has its own mind and it is only worried about I or the self. You take, for example, a narcissist, and you know the story of the narcissist. When he saw his reflection, he fell in love with himself. And so he was absorbed with himself. The ego may also take control over your logic or your reasoning because of the feeling that you may be having in the moment. You take anger, for example. We can sometimes become angry at certain situations, and you feel it here in the gut or in your spirit, and we have a choice either to act upon that anger by allowing it to dissipate or by lashing out or even yelling or even becoming physical in some cases. And so the ego can take control over our mind and our body, but in this case, the ego is only concerned with being fed with negativity. It's only concerned how to survive through negativity. And one such example can be in intimate relationships where you may be in an argument with your intimate partner and you begin to not take criticism very well, and you can start to act defensive. And as some spiritual teachers will say, you become unconscious and you are not in your right mind or balance, and you start to even attack your partner with words and with condescending terms and putting them down. And you begin to get the picture when you act in this defensive mode. But this is what the ego thrives on. It can only live as long as we feed it these things for it to survive. Again, the ego is only concerned of how to survive, and as long as we feed it what it wants, it remains. The ego also likes to find justification for why it should feel that way. And in some cases, again, in our intimate relationships, we may blame our partner for certain things, and we do not take accountability. We do not take responsibility. And so again, the ego starts to take over the mind and the body, and it is at the vanguard instead of putting it at bay, and it begins to take control of all our decisions. And this is why we sometimes say the ego has its own mind. Some real life examples may include maybe you were at the grocery store and someone told you a very rude thing, and you began to feel that friction and that feeling in your body, and maybe you wanted to respond, and this is again the ego tugging at you and trying to get you to follow its mind. Or maybe you are having casual conversation with friends or family, and you start to talk about occupations, and you may be asked what you do for a living, and as soon as you share that information, we can maybe sometimes start to compare ourselves with others in their occupation, and it becomes a situation where I make more money than you, or it's a comparison of what the ego is wanting to surface. And if we are to contrast this in the spirit of humility, you may not share exactly what you do. You may minimize your job title to something else, but in its true sense, the ego is always trying to justify itself, compare itself to others and how it is better. It is always defending itself, and allowing certain negative emotions to overtake the entire being. Now that we have a pretty good understanding of the ego, what are some spiritual applications that we can implement to have success over the ego? Well, Buddha made reference to the self in that we should become emptied of everything around us, our surroundings, our thoughts, and we completely empty ourselves, and there is no longer the self, but consciousness. Jesus said in his spiritual teachings that one should deny themselves or take up the cross and follow him. And this was a spiritual application to teach us in modern times that when we deny ourselves, we are no longer thinking in the mind of the ego, but we are thinking in spiritual terms. Some practical examples that we can give to make sure that we are not being controlled by the ego mind is that the next time we may receive a criticism from our intimate partner or from a coworker or a family member, we become still. And in stillness, we can think. There is space, there is consciousness, and we can begin to recognize the feeling in our spirit, but we allow it to pass through us, and we do not allow it to remain in us, because again, we begin to feed the ego its food, and that's how it begins to remain. Another great example is the examples of Eckhart Tolle, and he shares that when we have a certain negative feeling enter into our spirit, we detach the self or ourselves from that, our mind, and we become the witness to it or the watcher. And so we are no longer the feeling, we are no longer our thoughts. We have stepped back. In other words, we come out of that and we see and feel the feeling, but we do not take action. Another spiritual teaching of old was that of Paul. And Paul stated that we can capture every thought that enters into our mind. Jesus said it is not what goes into the heart of man, but what comes out. And so, again, this is the spiritual teaching that we do have thoughts, we do have negativity that may enter, but it is when we act upon it, it is what comes out of the man or woman that begins to define them. And this is how we can use the power of spirituality to keep the ego in control and to keep it where it needs to stay, and that is not within our consciousness. In other words, we remain whole and pure in everything we do, even with the challenges in intimate relationships, even with financial struggles, even with the challenges of our health, all these feelings that enter, we have the spiritual power to allow it to pass through us, and we remain still. We remain calm. And in that space, we can meditate, we can go out into nature and maybe reset our mind in our balance. We can exercise. We can take small walks in the park or somewhere that is serene and peaceful. And all these spiritual techniques can strengthen us, and eventually we come to the point where we are no longer operating from the ego mind, but we are operating from the spiritual mind.